bit. Can you talk about the origins of white supremacy versus the invention of the white race versus racial oppression? Are they connected? Are they separate issues? And I'm sort of asking this rhetorically.
Well, I think that they're connected ultimately. I think that all of these different tropes seek to answer the question on how and why it was that at a certain point in history, Europeans descended upon this continent and uprooted the indigenous population, generally liquidated the indigenous population, and then began to import enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to work for free. Now, as I tell the story in my book on the 16th century, it has a lot to do with religion. That is to say, 1492 was followed by 1517 and the secession of Martin Luther from the Vatican, from the Catholic Church, taking London by storm by the 1530s, leading to a round robin of religious sectarian conflicts, London almost being toppled by His Catholic Majesty in the 1580s, London wanting to get in on the colonial feasts inaugurated by His Catholic Majesty in the Caribbean shortly after Columbus's voyage, having not the sufficient numbers to contest the Catholics. They're the Protestants are the scrappy underdogs. So they move to incorporate those with whom they had been warring, the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, into this new identity politics of whiteness. Interestingly enough, some of our so-called friends on the left, they oftentimes invoke the term identity politics as a way to defame the Black liberation movement and the struggle of the descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class. That's identity politics, not the construction of whiteness, for example, not Zionism, for example, a system based upon an exclusive ethno-religious descriptor. In any case, back to the thread, whiteness eventually is expanded to include others who have been warring on the shores of Europe. That is to say, British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Baltics versus Russian, Serb versus Croat. The list is endless. Magically, once they cross the Atlantic, they're rebranded as, quote, white, unquote. The system is so elastic, or to put it another way, the system is so desperate to recruit those to combat the indigenous and uproot them from their land that ultimately they include the melanin deficient who are Christians from Lebanon, from Egypt, etc. So that's my take on the construction of white supremacy. Of course, my take in my book goes back to the Crusades 1100 years ago, but of course, one could probably go back earlier than that.
Interesting. Can you say a little bit more about the Crusades and possibly going back a little further?
Well, the Crusades, that is to say, this attempt by Western European Christendom to reclaim what they call the Holy Land from the Muslims, leads to centuries of conflict between Muslims and Christians. And in fact, when Christopher Columbus sails in 1492, this is in the wake of the ultimate expulsion of Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain in particular. At the same time, the Catholics in Spain are moving towards the Inquisition, that is to say, torturing and killing the Jewish minority until and unless they convert. And there's evidence to suggest that there were Jewish people fleeing on Columbus's vessels when he was sailing in 1492. Now, of course, you may be familiar with the work of the late Howard University classicist Frank Snowden, the book Before Color Prejudice, where he suggests that this anti-Blackness that lies close to the root of white supremacy is a relatively recent invention. Others are not necessarily in accord with that particular thesis, but in any case, I mentioned the Crusades and the conflicts between Muslims and Christians in particular, because as I say in my 16th century book, and it's important to say that what I'm talking about, I've written about. So go back and look at what I've written. Don't just listen to what I have to say and reject it or accept it. Go back and look at it, check the sources, check the footnotes if you're serious. And what I argue is that in some ways, what happens, particularly if you look at the Jewish population of England, which is expelled in the late 13th century. By the 16th century, you see the kinds of negative tropes that had once been applied to the Jewish minority or transferred to Black people, for example, in terms of supposedly having tails, supposedly having a special odor, banning intermarriage, etc. And that's what I mean about the religious roots of racism and white supremacy, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to extirpate, not to mention the religious roots as noted in the aforementioned conjoining, or I should say conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, where at one point one is burning the other at the stake, but 300 years later, they're joining hands, conjoining, and burning Black people at the stakes, for example. Therein, you see the roots of white supremacy. You see how religious conflict is transmuted into a so-called racial conflict. But alas, with the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a successful revolt by the enslaved or the unpaid sector of the working class, which I'm afraid to say many of our friends on the left have paid insufficient attention to, although supposedly they're all in favor of workers' rights. But somehow that didn't come to include the Haitians and their successful revolt. That inaugurates the class era, which leads to a general crisis of the system of slavery reconciled with its collapse in United States, 1865, Brazil, 1888.
Right. So just going back a little bit to the Crusades and the Iberian Peninsula, were they Moors and Berbers that had established themselves in the Iberian Peninsula, meaning, and were they people of African descent and with darker complexions? And does that, in addition to the religion, did that play a role at all?
Well, to a certain degree, but don't try to impute contemporary thinking
Right.
back into the late 15th century. But certainly, I mean, if you look at your map, obviously there's about 7 miles separating the African continent from southern Spain, and it's just a hop, skip, and a jump across the Mediterranean from Morocco and Algeria, for example, into southern Spain. And of course, with the uh, victories of the Arabs reaching from the Arabian Peninsula, heading westward, you had many of those folks as well becoming involved in these European conquests.
Can you talk about the Irish and how they were oppressed and how this model that we have, this settler colonial model, is just a social construct? It's a tool of the ruling class to to use power, and that they have various tools, like what they've done in India is different than what they've done in America. But what's done in America was very similar to what was done in Ireland.
Well, Ireland's often spoken of as England's first colony. The conflicts stretch back centuries, some would say 800 years, and the conflicts continue to this very day, albeit in a muted fashion, muted compared to what was happening at the apex of this conflict. But as noted, there's a kind of reconciliation between English and Irish once they crossed the Atlantic. I always found it striking that you had these Irish American politicians like the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who always liked to tout their so-called Irish credentials. And at the same time, they were big-time anti-Black racists, particularly Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the former senior senator from the state of New York. And of course, it's not only North America. You had an Irish migration to Australia, an Irish migration to Southern Africa, Scottish migrations at the same time. And in fact, you can make an argument, and actually this argument is represented in my book on the 17th century, that when you have the coming together in 1707 of the various constituent elements of the British Isles, that it's not coincidental that that happens in the context of the expansion of settler colonialism, because in some ways, these so-called minorities, if I can use that term, like the Scots and the Irish, many of them, in a sense, are being bought off by being able to participate in the colonial feast. That is to say, the colonial feast in North America. The research in the United States, I don't think, has been adequate insofar as plumbing the ethnic roots of many of the so-called founding fathers of the United States of America, in terms of were there roots in Ireland, were there roots in England, were there roots in Scotland, for example. This helps to underscore the point that many of us make, that some on the left refuse to engage, which is that history is an ongoing debate. I get the idea that some people on the left see history not as an ongoing debate, but as spouting settled postulates. And then if you contradict those settled postulates by digging up new evidence or coming across new perspectives, it can lead to your being called a fascist, for example, which is one of the descriptors I just saw recently applied to myself.
Wow, wow, wow. And can you talk about racism as being a core or fundamental piece of capitalism and how that's started and how that's being used today? Many of us talk about capitalism, but we sort of don't include the race part as being an integral component of it.
Well, as I tell the story, and once again, it's embedded in my 17th century book, and it's also reflected in the works of the Nigerian scholar Joseph Inakure of University of Rochester, and embedded in the work of the late Caribbean scholars Walter Rodney and Eric Williams. Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. As I tell the story, what happens is that at a certain point, you have a beheading of the monarchy in London, which is taking place at the same time that their successors, led by Oliver Cromwell, or ousting the Spanish from Jamaica. And at the same time, in Brazil, you see another Protestant power, speaking of the Dutch, being ousted from their temporary sojourn in Brazil, with the Portuguese Catholics making a comeback in their colony. And what happens is that many of those who had been in Brazil, who happened to be Jewish, by the way, who had been involved in sugar production in Brazil, flee en masse to Jamaica, because, as noted, with this concept of whiteness, the Protestants, the scrappy underdogs, were able to incorporate many of those who happened to be Jewish, even though, as I said, with regard to London, they'd expelled the Jewish population centuries earlier. With those folks migrating to Jamaica, you have the rise of the sugar boom, so-called, which leads to fabulous wealth, because sugar is seen not only as a way to sweeten one's tea, but as a kind of miracle drug, creating enormous wealth that's then poured into shipbuilding, which is used to transport more Africans across the Atlantic, more settlers across the Atlantic, producing a working class of shipyard workers, leading to this circle devoid of virtue, involving production of great amounts of wealth being poured into production. And therein you begin to see the seeds of capitalism. And I should mention, of course, that in my book further, I talk about how that leads inevitably to an expansion of the African slave trade with the rise of the Royal African Company in the 1670s. And then the bourgeois, or the merchant class, I should say, make another comeback in the 1680s, because recall that Oliver Cromwell's tenure was rather short-lived, and the monarchs make a comeback. And then by the 1680s, their wings are clipped, creating this present monarchy, where they have incredible wealth, but are not necessarily ruling, speaking of today's King Charles. And what happens is that the Royal African Company, which had been under the thumb of the monarch, Uh, you have that disrupted with the era that I call in my book free trade in Africans. That is to say, with merchants entering the African slave trade in great numbers, with return on investment of an eye-watering 1,700% in some cases, which creates more wealth involving more enslavement of Africans, more ships, etc., in this circle devoid of virtue. And therein you begin to see the rise of capitalism. You begin to see also the rise of slave revolts, particularly in the Caribbean, which, as I tell the story, leads to the Great Trek from the Caribbean to the North American mainland up until about 1750. London sees the Caribbean as more valuable than the North American mainland, and even after 1750, for that matter. And of course, coming to the mainland brings no surcease. There's still slave revolts. 1712, New York City, 1739, South Carolina, 1741, New York City. Of course, the settlers try to do an end run around this process by establishing a so-called all-white colony in Georgia in 1733. But alas, that doesn't work because it basically imports class contradictions between and amongst Europeans across the Atlantic. These settlements were supposed to be a way to circumvent class contradictions, not recreate them in the new world, so to speak. And not to mention the fact that South Carolina borders Georgia, and many of the settlers were slyly importing African labor, even though they were not supposed to be doing so. And ultimately, of course, we know the story since per the 2010 census, Georgia had more Black people than any other state in the USA. So obviously, uh, creating the all-white colony did not work, so to speak. But in any case, this leads to an attempt by Spain in the south and Florida, the French in the north and Quebec to overthrow the rule of London in the so-called colonies. But that leads to the so-called 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, where London is able to deliver a knockout blow to the French in Quebec and to the Spanish in Florida. But then this is where the traditional narrative kicks in, and also usually where our friends on the left arrive on the scene. You know, they're not too conversant with any history before 1756. That seems to be the starting point. That's where they pick up the story. With the 7 Years' War, then the English or the Londoners ask for more taxes. The settlers, as they are today, don't like to pay taxes. I guess they're too accustomed to people working for free on their behalf. And that plants the seeds of a revolt, helped along by the fact of the so-called proclamation line, where London expresses displeasure at continuing to move west, attacking Native American nations, and so that land speculators like George Washington can prevail. In my fall 2025 book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, I'm able to get a peek at the last will and testament of George Washington, which I quote at length. And you won't believe the amount of land that this one guy controlled. For example, I mean, he makes Donald Trump look like a piker by way of comparison. His lineal descendant in more ways than one, or his lineal ancestor in more ways than one, to put it another way. In any case, that and increasing reliance on Black troops in the British Empire. You might be familiar with this Denzel Washington movie made early in his career. I think it's called For Queen and Country, where he plays a Black soldier in the red coat, for example. It's worth seeing. In any case, that leads to contradictions along with a mass movement in the British Isles against slavery. And that plants the seeds for the revolt of 1776. And as I said before, it's not just Gerald Horne and Nicole Hannah-Jones that have been raising questions about 1776. Although, interestingly enough, it's been mostly Black intellectuals, for whatever reason, with the so-called white left counterattacking vigorously, in some ways de facto supporting the 1776 commission of one Donald J. Trump.